the problem of divine hiddenness. And so you'll see in your outline, point number 2 on page 7, that I've got a discussion of this. And I want to give you a general statement of the problem and then unpack it a little bit and describe a way to respond. The general problem, you'll recall, is that people sometimes believe that the absence of evidence for God's existence is evidence that God does not exist. And the reason why they think that is because they think that if God did exist, there would be stronger evidence that he exists than there actually is. Now, this is one kind of problem for the skeptic, and it's another kind of problem for the believer. So it includes us all. For the skeptic, the problem is looking out on the world, contemplating his own experience, listening to the evidence and the arguments presented, and still feeling that it all comes up short. There just isn't good reason to believe that God exists. Now, he's got 2 reasons, he thinks, to believe that God does not exist. First, he has no good evidence, and he doesn't want to believe without evidence. That's his view. And second, he thinks that because there's no evidence, that is evidence that he doesn't exist. Because again, if he did, that is, if God did, there would be evidence forthcoming. Now, why does he think that? Because he thinks that God is the sort of being who would want his creatures to know that he exists. This would be a function of his love for humanity. If God exists, then God is utterly worthy of worship, but wouldn't be if he wasn't perfectly loving. And that means he would want us to know of his existence and be able to be in relationship with him on some level. That is something many skeptics believe. But believing that, they think that there is no such evidence, and so we have evidence that God does not exist. Now, that's a problem for the skeptic. For the believer, the problem is as follows. This believer thinks that God does exist, and maybe thinks there's very good evidence for the existence of God, and has frequently rehearsed the evidence for himself, for others, and presented that and thought it very compelling. Does this provide a sufficient response for his own satisfaction in dealing with this problem of divine hiddenness? Well, a skeptic might say it shouldn't, and for the following reason. The skeptic might say to the believer, well, you think that you have ample evidence for the existence of God, and that's all very well and good, but I'm telling you that I don't. And that should be a problem not only for me, but for you. Because the God you believe in is the sort of being who would, if he wanted to, provide evidence for me, but hasn't, and if he existed, he would want to. So my lack of evidence overwhelms your sense that you have adequate evidence. Do you see the problem? So we should have some kind of answer to this, and I'd like to talk briefly about that. I'm not going to say much about 2.31, but it has to do with this idea. A non-evidentialist response would simply say that you can have justified belief that God exists even if it's not grounded in what many people think of as evidence, like arguments for the existence of God. And Bill did a great job talking about one way to think about that when he was talking about how we have direct acquaintance with things like our own minds, the minds of other people, the existence of a physical world, sometimes called an external world because it's external to ourselves, and so on. We don't try to give arguments for those sorts of things, and if we did, we'd fall short, but we don't doubt that they're true because we do have evidence of a sort. It's just evidence that is direct through our acquaintance with those things, and it might be possible to have that kind of encounter with God that would give you that kind of justification for believing in God, but you wouldn't have an argument. And it wouldn't be evidence that you could give someone else because they would have to have their own encounter. That's one approach. But the evidentialist really does want to say, but there is a way to talk about evidence for the skeptic who gets hung up on this point. And here's how I would do it. I would say start with the concept of God and emphasize the following two things first and foremost. First, that God is utterly worthy of worship. Now, God may not exist, but I think it is a conceptual truth that if God does exist, then this has to be true about God. If God does not exist, well, then there's something that is sort of the greatest thing that does exist, but it doesn't qualify as God just because it's the greatest thing that exists if it's not worthy of worship. So you could have the concept of God that includes this, his utter worship worthiness, and yet think that there is no God. Now, together with that is the second point, and that is that God is perfectly loving. You see, God isn't worthy of worship if he exists just because he's the greatest thing out there, all-powerful, all-knowing, and so forth. It's going to be because, in part, he is also omnibenevolent. So he's omnipotent, yes. He's omniscient, yes. But he's omnibenevolent. That is, he is morally perfect. And he wouldn't be worthy of worship if he was omniscient and omnipotent but lacked omnibenevolence. Or so I think, at least. Now, some people worship beings they call deities or gods that fall short of this conception of God, because they don't think that this conception of God matches anything in the real world. So they're kind of stuck with a lower level reality, but it's the best there is. And I want to say it's a mistake to call that God if this is the right way to think about what it would mean for there to be a God, you see. So now then, having thought through the concept of God with the open question, does this concept answer to anything in the real world, that is to say, really exists? I don't mean in the physical world, but just exists. We might want to consider what kind of evidence a being of that sort would provide if he existed and wanted you to know it. So that's an interesting question. Now, there might be evidence that God sort of can't help but provide because of things he's done. If he created the universe and his fingerprints are all over it, he becomes a suspect, and what can he do? It's a consequence of creating the universe. Maybe it's a secondary fact about God's intentions. His real intention was just to create a world. He didn't really care whether people believed in him or not, but, it kind of gives him away. That's a possibility. But what we're considering here is not what kind of evidence there might be that God did exist, whether he planned it that way or not, but what kind of evidence he would give us if he was worthy of worship, morally perfect, and wanted us to believe. And here's what I think. He wants more than just our conviction that there's a God. You see, he doesn't want us just to believe a proposition. The proposition, God exists, is true. Now, if God exists, it is true, and it would be good to believe it simply because it's true. We are naturally, I should say, all of us, truth interested. And we are exquisitely evidence sensitive. Now, that's something we'll come back to, but what I'm stressing at this point is to contemplate what this kind of being might provide in the way of evidence if he wanted us to believe in a way that mattered to him and not just to us. And all too many people settle for believing in the propositional sense, just tell me, does God exist or not, and let me get back to life. Now I want to give you a definition, my definition of secularism, a pervasive attitude in our culture today. I think that secularism is little more than an attitude that God, if he even bothers to exist, is irrelevant. And so it can be an interesting intellectual exercise to contemplate the arguments and go through them all and then come to the conclusion, yes, God exists. But then just go on with your life, acting as if it makes no difference. Now, do you think God is interested in that? You see, when a skeptic says, the evidence should be there because surely God would want us to believe that he exists, he misses what kind of belief God would want us to have. It's not just propositional. It's also going to be relational. Right? God is going to want us, he's going to want to have our hearts and not just some aspect of our minds. But he might not be willing to provide you with evidence that would, in a way, force you to worship him, which wouldn't be worship because you wouldn't be doing it freely. You see, a worship-worthy being who is perfectly loving cannot be worshiped except freely. And so he can't present evidence to you that would, in effect, force you to go through the motions of worship if you really didn't want to. And so I believe there is a kind of evidence that God can give you that I cannot, that no one at this conference can, but that I have and that many people do, that God alone provides, but only under certain conditions. And those are conditions that God wills. We have to be willing to be submissive to his will, come what may, understanding that he is worthy of our worship and perfectly loving if it should happen that he exists. And that is a very important question to ask the skeptic. I debated an atheist a couple of years ago from the northern part of the Midwest, but we were in the South where we did the debate. And after the debate, where I had made this point, we went way into the early hours of the morning at a Denny's next door to our hotel talking about this point. And I said, would you at least be willing to say, if God exists and this is what it means for God to be God, then I would happily seek to fulfill his will, whatever it is, come what may. Because after all, we're talking about a perfectly loving God who wouldn't want anything but your best. And you know what he said? I would choose not to do that. And I said, can you give me a reason for that? And he said, no. It's just my choice. And that's my point. But he said other people might make that decision, and it wouldn't be irrational. Very interesting concession. And I think that the kind of evidence that God provides under those conditions, even though we fallibly move towards God in this way, is through our conscience and our experience of moral truths and moral reality, our own failure and our dependence on a holy God to live our lives. So I want to commend to you the availability of evidence that God himself can give you, but only if you come to that with the right attitude, because he will not coerce belief of the sort that issues in worship. And if you're content to just believe a proposition, then he might just say, fine, listen to Geivett. If that's all you want. But I want to say that's not all there is. You understand? The importance of that.